Okay, so today we're going to be going over our first part of scientific literacy, and we're going to be looking at scientific review papers. So first, just the difference between a research paper and a review paper. So in your classes, you've probably heard of like primary sources, secondary sources. So a research paper is a primary source. It's a report on original research that was done by a scientist. And this type of paper kind of describes the methods that they used, the results that they obtained, how they analyzed those results, and the different conclusions and findings that they discovered. And a review paper is a secondary source, so it reviews a lot of research papers and it kind of analyzes the different findings. So it's kind of condensing the information of multiple research papers. And in these review papers, the scientists kind of synthesize or analyze the research that are conducted by other scientists. So they're basically looking at primary sources and analyzing those. Okay, and so just to go over like the importance of review papers, so obviously we know that research papers are important because they're reporting on different research that's been done. And oftentimes they'll have like discoveries that are made and new data that's super important for scientists. But review papers are also important because they serve as a basis of knowledge for development. So basically they form the foundation of the information that's already known and can be built upon. And they also create models for methods that are used in further research, and they give like guidelines for describing certain concepts in research papers. So if a scientist were to discover something, there's like a different sort of guideline that's like defined for like how to describe those concepts so that everyone has a consensus and that it's easier for people to understand. And they also provide evidence of applications or findings that have been shown across multiple research projects and papers. And so on a daily basis, many research papers are published, and it's not feasible to be able to read all of them. And so review papers kind of help break them down for you. And so this more organized and condensed information can help you generate new ideas and research directions based on the information from other research papers or gaps that exist in those research papers that you want to look into. Um, and finally, the review papers provide reliable information about a specific field of study for scientists and readers alike, and this can help direct the scientists to more articles that are related to their research. So it can be like a good first source to look at to find other primary sources. And so why is scientific literacy important? Scientific literacy is currently an issue in the scientific community. Most of the time, it's used as a way to exclude underrepresented groups from participating in science because these people might not have the knowledge to be able to read scientific paper and to be able to understand the information that's presented in there. So some initiatives that are currently being implemented in the scientific community is to use vocabulary words that are more accessible and understandable to the general public. Um, and here we're trying to overcome this issue by helping all of you develop scientific literacy at a younger age. And so even if you don't fully understand what we're talking about today, having this exposure and going through the process of reading a scientific article will help you in the future when you're required to do it for your classes. And so don't worry if you don't get this on the first try. For me personally, I had to go to many presentations about research papers and kind of go through many research papers to be able to understand and analyze like the ideas that are presented. And then this is also important for those of you wanting to pursue health careers because it's important to understand how to communicate with your patients so that they understand what you're talking about. And there's no like communication barrier based on like the vocabulary that's being used because as you advance in the field, you'll start using more advanced vocabulary. And it's important to be able to communicate with patients who might not have that advanced vocabulary. And so just before we get started, some general strategies that I find helpful when reading review papers is printing it out and underlining the important concepts. And so when reading research papers, this is a little bit different because you'll be highlighting not the concepts, but the procedures and the data that are presented to you. In general, though, I think like annotating the paper is helpful for finding information that's important for your purposes, whether it's understanding the paper and building your knowledge, or whether you're trying to extract specific information based on what you're learning in class or like what you have to do in like a chemistry lab. Okay, so just to start, the structure of a review paper usually includes an abstract, an introduction, a discussion, and then conclusion and future directions. So in a review paper, they're not as much focused on like the different methods that were used and the different like analyses of the data, but more about discussing like the different research papers that they're looking at, kind of similarities across them, and the different like methods that are drawn from them. And something that's very important is also to look at figures because they can be super helpful. And also, a lot of times, there are a lot of pages in review papers, but don't be intimidated by that because half of the pages are like figures or references. So just try to like read through it slowly and take your time. And today our agenda is to go over 2 review papers if possible, depending on number of questions that you guys have, and if we need to slow down a little, depending on the difficulty. The first paper is meant as like a first paper that you read in an introductory college course. So it should be a little bit more straightforward. And the second one is a little bit longer and more challenging, so we can go over that if we have time. And after each paper, I'll show you like a summary that I had to write and turn in for class so that you know like what's expected from you and what level of understanding is required at a college level. Okay, so the first paper, I actually have a PDF of it. So this is um, the Ubi and Brown paper that I sent out about DNA replication stress for cancer treatment. And this was like the first article that we read in the college class. So I think that'll be super helpful for you guys. So just here, this is the abstract. The abstract is generally like a summary, like a 1 paragraph summary about what the entire paper is about. So it's super helpful to be able to read this, like look at it first because it provides like the information that you'll need for the paper and you have a general idea about like what the paper talks about. So just going back to the slide here. So basically this abstract is telling you about the importance of DNA replication. And so they talk about DNA replication stress and what that is. So it's basically any disturbances in the process of DNA replication. And they're talking about how this is exhibited in cancer cells. And then they move on to talk about therapeutic approaches, so making different drugs that target these replication stress in cancer cells. And then they also talk about like the limitations to these therapies. And then after that, they talk about um, how these can like the integration of replication stress can be incorporated into current immunotherapies that are being um, like worked on right now, and how this is like incorporated into the immune response. Um, and then it talks about how this method is promising for further research, and they talk about the different lessons that they learned and how we can continue to target DNA replication stress in treatments moving forward. And so, even though it might seem intimidating because there's like a lot of vocabulary words, we can like look at it sentence by sentence and kind of break it down. And a lot of times when the paper is super long, it takes a long time. And so it's important to be patient and kind of look through it and like stop when you have a question. Most of the time when there's like a really difficult word, I tend to look it up. Um, so is that helpful? Like the way that this is broken down? Or does anyone have any further questions before we move into the next part? Oh, sorry, did I cut out somewhere? Mm. Okay, if I cut it out, I was just explaining the abstract. So if there's anything that you missed, any questions that you have, feel free to like private chat me and I can reply to that. Okay, so then the next, after you read the abstract, what you want to read next is the introduction. So depending on how long the introduction is, you can usually just skim it. The introduction usually just provides like a background for what the paper is going to be about. So if you have no idea what like DNA replication stress is, the introduction will tell you about that, and it tells you how that's incorporated into the paper. So here, these are the parts that I would highlight. So this defines replication stress right here. And then this section here talks about what the review paper is going to discuss. So right here, it tells you that replication stress is like a hindrance to DNA replication. So it's basically like a disturbance in that process. Um, so like here, it goes into how it slows or blocks or stops DNA polymerization, which is like a process in DNA replication. And then the rest of this part I would just skim. He's not like super relevant. And then it's important to look at like how this idea is being incorporated into the review paper. So it's just talking about how, again, like mentioned in the abstract, like how this can be incorporated into new treatments. And so it's just collecting a ton of data. You can see here they have a lot of references in these quotes. So these are just referencing different research papers, and like they're talking about this. And then when if you're like interested in a specific part of this, you can look at the specific source in the references. And then that's a way that looking at review papers can direct you to more relevant research papers. Okay. And then the discussion section is super long, so I can paste in here, but usually for the discussion section, you would just skim it. So this is like super long, but you can look at like the headers, which are really helpful. So this talks about the causes, consequences, and responses from the DNA replication stress. Um, and then this part isn't super important to read. You can just skim and like highlight really important ideas. So when you're skimming, you can typically read the first sentence of the paragraph and the last sentence of the paragraph. Um, and then it's a progression. So it talks about DNA replication stress and then how you can exploit it to treat cancer. And then it talks about the current therapies that use this replication stress. And then the next section talks about different like new therapies that are used in combination to target replication stress and different checkpoints of the cell cycle. So even if you don't know like what that might be, right? The replication stress was explained in the introduction. And then the cell cycle checkpoints are just like different points in when the cell is splitting and when it's growing. And so they're just targeting those to try to treat cancer. And so you'll also notice that there are a lot of figures. So these figures in particular are like super helpful just because we're not really familiar with like these processes. But if you were like a senior scientist and you knew about these processes, it could be easy for you to look at what's going on in these diagrams. Um, ooh, sorry. Okay. And then also I found this figure here. This is like a table, not like a diagram, but it talks about the different targets and agents and their function. Um, and this is like, I found this to be somewhat helpful, and it directs you to the different references, and it also tells you like whether these drugs have been approved or how far along in the process they are in getting approved. And so the last part that I would read is the conclusion, or here they called it future directions. So I actually have that in the next slide. Um, all right, so basically it just talks about um, what we know about replication stress and how it can be used in new technologies. Like they mentioned the CRISPR-Cas9, which is a new technology in this field. Um, and they also talk about different limitations in using this method to treat cancer and how we can use these limitations to kind of look to further research methods to develop stronger therapies. And so they talk about how many of these approaches are showing promise, um, and that in future therapeutic development or development of drugs, we'll be able to see like, the power of these new technologies. Um, and so basically what to keep in mind is that a review paper is just summarizing a lot of research papers. It just kind of gives you an idea of like the research that's being done in this field. Um, and so you don't really need like a really, really deep understanding of the paper to like write like a quick summary about it. Um, so like if you're looking at the paper for to like learn about the different subtitles here. So like if you're looking at specific drugs that are targeting like replication stress, you might want to look at these sections in the discussion more closely. But if you're just reading to get a general idea, it's sufficient to just skim through the discussion session. So I'm just going to show what our professor kind of expected from us in terms of writing like a summary. So this is a summary that I submitted for the class. Um, and this was completely sufficient. So here I just half of the paper or half of the summary is just talking about what the paper was about, and the second half is kind of an analysis on it and kind of like what I thought was good, what I thought was bad, and how it could be improved upon. So in the first half, I just said the review paper discusses the importance of DNA replication stress in present and emerging cancer therapies. And I talk about what they began with. So it was cellular processes and proteins affected by replication stress, as well as the consequences of replication stress. And then I talked about specific proteins. So I just like looked at specific proteins in the discussion section, but that's not like super important. It's just what's most important is that you understand like what the paper is talking about. So as long as you know that it's talking about the importance of DNA stress in present and emerging cancer therapies, that's like sufficient. Um, and then I just talked about um, the different ways to address DNA replication stress and kind of the obstacles to the approach. And then the last part is just very casual. So just like it had, I just mentioned that it had a concise abstract, um, conveyed the main idea, and everything kind of flowed well with the different headings. Um, and then at the end, I just said it was informative, engaging, and comprehensible. Um, so article summaries aren't super hard. Um, you just have to kind of reflect on it, and that's what is kind of expected from you at a first year like college level. Um, yeah, so it doesn't require you to like look really deep into the paper. Um, yeah, does anyone have any questions about like what it's like to read or papers in college, or like what the professor kind of expects from you in terms of like writing a summary, um, or like doing a reflection? If you have any questions, feel free to like put them in the chat and I can get to them. Okay, so the next paper is a little bit longer. If you look through the papers, you might see that it's 16 pages, but most of them are like diagrams. In this paper, I found the diagrams to be really helpful. Um, yeah, and so like at the bottom, you can see most of the pages are like references. So definitely don't be intimidated by the number of pages you see at the very beginning. So, okay, we can go over the next paper. Um, I'm not sure if we have enough time to go through it, but can try our best. So here, this is the abstract. So this paper is talking about, so at the beginning we had like a slide that said, that talked about like the purpose of a review paper. So the last one was kind of talking about the basis of knowledge, kind of compiling different research papers. This one is more of this point here to create guidelines for policy and practice. So they're providing a kind of framework for describing cancer research and kind of different components of this framework. And so they call it the hallmarks of cancer. And so this helps kind of break down the different um, phenotypes, which is like the phenotypes and genotypes. The phenotype is how the cancer shows up, so like how the gene is expressed. And the genotype pertains more to the genes. Um, and it just kind of breaks it down into different categories so that it's more it's easier and more straightforward to define. And so we talk about different epigenetic factors, different types of cells, how they originate. Um, and so it kind of concludes in like how these different cell types and factors are important in the tumor microenvironment, so like where the tumor is located, like the cells that are around it, and the different components of the cells that are like around it. Um, and then here in this abstract, it's really nice because they tell you like why it's important. So like why is it important to have this hallmark of cancer cycle? Um, and it's just telling you like how it can be applied to cancer research and kind of describing it in general and applying that to um, development and just our overall general knowledge of cancer medicine. Um, so just to look at this paper here, these here are the hallmarks of cancer, and they have been modified multiple times depending on like new findings and whether scientists have looked at it and decided there are better ways to categorize these types of cancer and like the cells and the components of this. Um, so the introduction here is also a little bit longer than the other one. Um, so you guys can skim through this also and kind of um, think about like what it's saying, and then I can talk about it and we can see like if our ideas line up to see if you have like a good understanding of what the paper is saying. And a lot of times these include like a lot of difficult vocabulary words, so it can be helpful to look them up. Or you can just skip over it and move on to something that you do understand. So that's like something good to do on a first scan, and then like on a second or third scan, you can read it more in depth. Okay, so I'm just gonna look through this and then kind of like walk you through my process of like what to highlight and what is important. So the first thing I would do is look at the figure, which we've already done. So these are different characteristics of like um, cancer cells. So they evade growth suppressors, um, they sustain proliferative signaling, um, they resist cell death, is unstable genomes, and also a lot of mutations. So these are basic characteristics of like cancer cells, and they're just basically describing it. And so in this introduction, they're talking about, so I would highlight this, like this part right here, because it talks about um, the different like capabilities or like the functions that the cell gains as they transform from um, normal cells to like cells that can grow um, without like unregulated growth. And so I think this first sentence is important for um, like describing what the article discusses. And then this sentence I feel is also important. I might not highlight it, I might like underline it. So this talks about like the intention of creating like the diagram and to help like understand um, the different types of human tumor cells and how different tumors can have uh, similar characteristics. And so this next sentence here is just talking about the credibility of the model um, and how it's like formed from um, recognizing how different types of cancers develop, and how that's like generalized into like a model that they made. And then this is something that I would highlight to include like in a summary. So this is just telling you what the 8 hallmarks currently are. So the 8 like capabilities that cells acquire as they develop from normal cells to cancer cells. And so it's just saying that like they started with 6 hallmarks of cancer, which are considered the core hallmarks of cancer, and there are 2 that have been added. Um, and this was a process of 11 years. So um, basically, these processes take time to develop, right? And with new information that's coming in every day from research, they are being updated. And so basically, you can see that it it takes a long time to kind of analyze the different parts of the article. So if you're like just skimming through it, you might not gain like a really good understanding of it. And so the discussion section talks about a lot of complex topics that even I haven't covered fully. So um, we can skip that section for now. But what I would do is I would read the final section, um, where they give you concluding remarks. So like how these hallmarks are like incorporated into studies. And basically the abstract, introduction, and concluding kind of give you like a summary. And it's important, like that's important for people who are just beginning, because it kind of gives you like it breaks it down for you. So you don't have to like look through the discussion um, and like read through it in depth because it could be time consuming and also it can be confusing for a lot of people. Um, so then just wanted to, I know we're running low on time, so I just wanted to show um, the article summary that I wrote for this paper. So this one is a little bit longer than the last one just because the paper was longer. Um, okay, I'm gonna move icon. Okay, so as I mentioned before, when I highlighted the 8 hallmarks of cancer, I included this in my summary. So I talked about proliferation, growth factors, resistance to cell death, and these were all mentioned in the paper. Um, so then I also mentioned like the limitations, so like how the hallmarks don't count for, um, because cancer is a really complex disease, and so even though the model can help simplify it, it doesn't account for all the complexities within the disease. And then I also wrote like a short sentence about the different hallmarks, um, and then so my summary section or the reflection section was a little bit um, shorter. So I just talked about how the paper was informative and raised directions for future research. Um, and then some important things to note when you're analyzing papers that I didn't know when I was reading papers is that you should look at the sources of funding to see if the authors might be biased. Um, and you can also, when reading the conclusion, you can kind of see if the authors jump to conclusions because sometimes when you have conclusions, you get more funding. So people are more incentivized to say that there are findings, even though it might not be certain. Um, and so it's important to note like the author's tone when they're writing these conclusions. Um, and then yeah, I just kind of reflected on the paper and what it discussed. So as you can see, you're not expected to have like a super deep understanding of the paper. You just need to have a general idea of what it's kind of discussing, and to gain that general idea, you can just get that from the abstract, the introduction, and the conclusion. And so, when you're writing a summary, it might be nice to like skim through the discussion, but you don't have to understand like every single point of it. And you can also use the figures because those are super helpful. And so, if anyone's like interested in reading more papers or like have any questions about this paper in specific, you can feel free to reach out to me. It's totally fine if you didn't understand like everything that was going on today. I tried to like break it down, kind of walk you through the process of like reading the paper. Um, but for me personally, it took many, many tries to be able to like analyze the paper and its meaning because it can be difficult. And not everyone is able to like read through a paper and like draw meaning from it. So it's important that you guys are starting at a young age so that you can have more time to develop those skills. Um, and having gained this exposure, it's like super beneficial to you. And then for me, when I first started, a tool that I used was like I had like a box diagram. In the middle, it was like, what is the main idea of this paper? And then on the side, it was like, what are the methods used? Why is this important? And then how can this be applied to other fields? And that was super helpful for me, like filling in the boxes and trying to draw meaning from the paper. Um, so if you guys have any questions, you can feel free to put it in the chat or reach out to me by email in the youth and pre-med email. But our next session is going to be on October 1st, where another one of our volunteers will be talking about how you can prepare for a medical career as a high school student or a middle school student just at a younger age, preparing for a medical career and different like skills you can gain, the different concepts you can learn. And then the week after that will be talking about research papers. Like that's where we want to get you to. The review papers are generally a little bit more easy to read, but after that we can talk about like research papers and different methods, and that'll be very important for research and for going into a scientific field. So if you guys don't have any questions, I think we have less than a minute left in this meeting. So thank you for coming and have a good weekend.